up, everyone? It's April 14th, 2019. Just got a couple things on my mind that I wanted to discuss. I have a friend group that is primarily made out of Asian Americans, and there's a lot of discussion between this friend group about race and privilege and, Asian American relations and Asian American experiences within society. I do applaud them for having honest discussion about these issues. But to be honest, I'm a little, well, not little, but I've been fairly frustrated about all these discussions. I think there's way too much discussion and emphasis and obsession with race. And I know this sounds very controversial, but I'm going to try to break it down and explain as best as I can. Firstly, I'm going to talk about privilege, and then I'm going to use that to segue into race. So when we first talk about privilege, it's a topic that's covered in class a lot. Writers have written about it, speakers have spoke about it. It's a very popular topic in terms of, ethnic studies. And you could say it's the belief that there's people in society, depending on their, characteristics such as race, sexual orientation, their physical health. Some people have advantages because they have these certain characteristics. And if you don't have, or you have other characteristics, then you're kind of at a disadvantage, whether it be how society labels you, whether it's racism or economic oppression. There are certain characteristics that give you a certain advantage or disadvantage. And a very popular subtopic within the topic of privilege is white privilege. How particularly if you're a Caucasian male, you didn't have to face the levels of racism that Black Americans faced throughout the history of the United States. How generally you have better economic outcomes and educational outcomes than Black Americans. And if you're like a Black American, if you're a Black female or Black male, generally you're born into a less economically successful environment, and how historical inequities have affected your ability to succeed under our current system. It's a very fascinating topic, and I think there's a lot of merit in discussing it. I took a course in college called The Psychology of Multi-Ethnic Groups, and the concept of privilege was spoken heavily about by the instructor. And besides it being fascinating, I think it's important to acknowledge and discuss there's connections between privilege to race and prejudicial treatment. We've talked about how individuals, depending on these characteristics, are treated better or worse. I personally think that it's not extremely helpful. The topic of privilege is not very helpful in terms of building bridges and building class consciousness. And I use that in a Marxist sense. I think it leads to something called, what people casually say is the ladder of oppression, or oppression Olympics, how the legitimacy of your voice depends on the level of oppression you face. Depending on your characteristics, if you're, let's just say, transgender, if you're Black, if you're female, in these circles in these discussion circles where privilege is discussed, there seems to be a tendency to give legitimacy to those voices, as opposed to people who come from, the higher rungs of oppression or less oppression. If you're, Caucasian, if you're male, I don't think it's very beneficial to use privilege in terms of argumentation and trying to convince people, because I think it's divisive. What I've seen on the internet and on classroom settings and academic settings is the concept of privilege is used to shut down voices in discussion. And like I said earlier, the legitimacy of your voice and how the legitimacy of your voice is connected to the level of oppression you face. So I think it turns into a way to shut out individuals from speaking, um, and I think it puts people on the defensive because when you say things like you have to check your privilege or oh you have to acknowledge your privilege before you jump into the discussion. I think people who are genuinely experiencing hardship when they're told to check their privilege or to hear that their voice may not be as important as other people who've faced oppression. I think that terms to shut people out of the discussion, terms to make people feel defensive, it makes people not want to listen to you. So I don't think it's a very helpful tool to build bridges and to find allies. And additionally, just as an example, there's a lot of poor white people in the United States. And in these circles where privilege is discussed, I think there's real suffering by individuals. And when you say, like, oh, you need to check your privilege, or you still have an advantage because you're Caucasian, or you're male, or you're physically healthy, I think that tends to get a lot of people riled up because economic suffering is it's real. When you don't have enough money to pay the bills, you can't afford healthcare, you can't maybe you can't pay rent or your mortgage or pay for your car. That's really real. And when you shut people out of this discussion, they're going to tend to not like you or antagonize you, or I don't think it's very helpful. So I think that's a very common example with criticisms of this privilege theory. Additionally, I think in terms of privilege, there's a connection to identity politics. And identity politics, just broadly speaking, is the advocacy of policies that are influenced by a group's identity or how they see themselves. You're advocating for something because of that identity group's unique experiences or challenges that they've faced. But see, I don't think this is necessary. Identity politics is necessarily a bad thing. We all come from different backgrounds. We all experience different things. The Black experience in the United States is different than the Asian American experience. I mean, we've both faced, and that's just an example I'm using, we've both faced oppression, but there's different levels, there's different types. Obviously, Black Americans, there's the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow. For Chinese Americans, for example, there was Chinese Exclusion Act. There was people couldn't move out of Chinatowns, and there's the minority thing. So the way that society treats us is different, between groups, and especially if you're gay, transgender compared to straight, then you've gone through a very different experience as well. But I think identity politics is very harmful and has some extremely bad tendencies today that I think it takes another podcast to really talk about, especially the weaponization of identity politics within our current political system. Right now, identity politics is used to its focus on access within capitalism. And by access, I mean there's more participation in our economic system. So currently, what's important in identity politics is diversity and representation, and that could be, women in tech. That could be hiring more minorities and promoting them to higher positions, such as CEOs, board members. And a good example of this was President Obama. There was a lot of people in the mainstream press and pundits and analysts that thought that, hey, we must have solved racism because President Obama, a black man, is now the president of the United States. But people who preach this kind of identity politics are so focused on just having that face in the position. There's too much emphasis on identity and not on policy, on what you actually do for, the country or the people that you're representing. So, for example, like I said, Obama's black, but yet his foreign policy destroyed black and brown lives. He did covert missions in Africa. Obviously, he escalated the conflict. He did a bunch of drone strikes in the Middle East. He overthrew Gaddafi, continued the wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. So he was harming black and brown lives. He didn't prosecute the banks that were involved in the financial crash of 2008. And these banks they screwed over a lot of black lives. He didn't help people who lost all their homes. A lot of black Americans suffered greatly because of the financial meltdown. He didn't take marijuana off the Schedule 1 list, which marijuana arrests and convictions disproportionately affect black lives. He deported more individuals than any other president before him. Obviously, that's very concerning. So what I'm trying to get at is, just because you get the chance to become the boss or the chance to become the exploiter doesn't mean that the system works. Maybe the fact that you succeed and maybe someone else doesn't, maybe that's proof that the system doesn't work. So just by having, diversity, and you're having representation, media, in jobs, in politics, it doesn't mean that the system is working, because there's still oppression that people face. Just because you're part of the system and you're in a very successful, if you've succeeded financially, whatever, it doesn't mean that injustice is gone. And I would say this type of identity politics, it reinforces our exploitative capitalist system. There's no focus on radical change, about really switching up our social relations, making social revolution, and altering our economic system. Identity politics doesn't focus on the overthrow of capitalism, our exploitative economic system. There's no focus on big changes such as ending our wars. In fact, like I said, Obama pretty much expanded our aggressive foreign policy throughout the Middle East and Africa. There's no pushing for things like Medicare for all. So it's kind of, in my view, I think it's just a charade of making the owners of capital more diverse. Like there's this famous quote, I think Cornel West uses it, but I think it's the actual person who came up with the quote was some other academic. He says, "Black faces in high places." By putting a diverse group of people into positions of power, it doesn't necessarily mean that the structure of our system is going to move towards a more humane, just direction. It just diversifies the powerful. Unfortunately, the privilege, identity politics, and race, it's the main form of political and social analysis today. There's so much academic theory that's been built around this concept of race. It's kind of, on one hand, it's extremely fascinating and interesting. But I think if we're aiming for a just society, if we're aiming for a communist future, I don't think it's very helpful to just associate with our racial or gender identity. We have to start focusing on class. When you divide people on these identities, like, hey, you're Asian, you're a female, you're transgender, you're black, you're white. This threatens class consciousness. That we realize that we are working class, that it's up to the working class to forge a path towards a more humane and just economic system. Identity is treated as a constant truth, and all these theories and all these topics are designed around it. This is in comparison to scientific Marxism. And, I think I'm going to talk about this in another podcast, but it's objective. We can objectively see that we are members of the working class, that we don't own any sort of wealth generating means of production. We have to sell our ability to work in order to survive. We earn wages. We are disconnected from our work. This is an observable fact. And if we really think about it, these identities, race and identity is a social construct. And I don't mean that to diminish the very real oppression and injustice that people have faced because of their race or their identity. I just find it frustrating that we've developed all these theories and around a socially constructed term and grouping instead of the objective realities of class. Identity is treated kind of as an end. Like, what's the goal? Is it the elimination of racism? I mean, sure, we all should be anti-racist. We all should fight for the elimination of racist policies, racial discrimination, and prejudice. But what is the goal? I mean, we can say we eliminate racism, but how can we measure that? How can we say that no longer exists in our society? We are de jure free of discriminatory laws in the United States after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. I think we pretty much, overt racism is pretty much out. Obviously, there's still, isolated pockets of very overtly racist individuals, but we can keep analyzing this and start tackling microaggressions. But after microaggressions, what's after that? Obviously, I'm comparing this to Marxism, which is, understanding the world through historical materialism, understanding the workings of capitalism and why it'll fail, and the advancement of communism. There's a clear goal, but for the people who subscribe to this liberal framework, what is the end result of identity politics? Is it a capitalist system without racism? I don't think you can fully eliminate racism within capitalism, because capitalism produces and thrives on racism and bigotry to divide the working class. And then I think there's this problem with intersectionality, which is a very popular word that individuals use today. And hopefully I'm summarizing this theory correctly. If I'm not, please feel free to correct me. I need to know if I'm falling short or not. But from my understanding, intersectionality is the theory that forms of oppression are linked. And depending on your identity, you may experience different forms of oppression. And, depending on your gender, race, class, or sexual orientation, they're all related to each other in some way or form. Intersectionality theory, I think there's some shortcomings because it doesn't explain, it just says they are connected, and people explain, depending on where you are with these characteristics, you experience oppression in different ways. But I don't think it doesn't explain these concepts as part of a system, where these forms of oppression came from, how it came from, and how to destroy it. So that's my problem with intersectionality. So again, if I'm falling short, feel free to let me know. So I think we have to reject this liberal identity politics framework, and we have to acknowledge the limitations of privilege. Rejecting identity politics and the hierarchy of oppression, it doesn't mean that we reject that oppression happens to different groups or it happens in different forms. But we have to acknowledge and understand that these forms of oppression are a part of a class struggle against capitalism. They're all related to this economic system that we must struggle against. We need to understand that these forms of oppression must be linked back into class struggle and to build class consciousness, so we realize that we're part of the working class and we must struggle together as the working class. We also must realize that the capitalist system must be eliminated because it produces and thrives on dividing the working class, whether it's through the demonization of immigrants, the bigotry against Muslims, whether it's portraying Black Americans in a negative light. It's all used to divide us. And we need to unite together as the proletariat in order to defeat the capitalist system.